Continuing lectures 4 and 5, The Religion of Healthy-mindedness, from the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. One of the doctrinal sources of mind cure is the four Gospels. Another is Emersonianism, or New England Transcendentalism. Another is Berkeleyan idealism. Another is Spiritism, with its messages of law and progress and development. Another, the optimistic popular science evolutionism, of which I have already spoken. And finally, Hinduism, the British term for everything going on over there, has contributed a strain. But the most characteristic feature of the mind cure movement is an inspiration much more direct. The leaders in this faith have an intuitive belief in the all-saving power of healthy-minded attitudes as such, in the conquering efficacy of courage, hope, and trust, and a correlative contempt for doubt, fear, worry, and all nervous precautionary states of mind. Cautionary Verses for Children is a title of a much-used work published in the early 1800s, showing how far the muse of evangelical Protestantism in England, with her mind fixed on the idea of danger, had at last drifted away from the original gospel freedom. Mind cure, New Thought, might be briefly called a reaction against all that religion of chronic anxiety, which is marked by the earlier part of the 1900s in the evangelical circles of England and America. Their belief has, in a general way, been corroborated by the practical experience of their disciples, and this experience forms today a mass imposing in amount. The blind have been made to see, the halt to walk. Lifelong invalids have had their health restored. The moral fruits have been no less remarkable. The deliberate adoption of healthy-minded attitude has proved possible to many who never supposed they had it in them. Regeneration of character has gone on an extensive scale, and cheerfulness has been restored to countless homes. The indirect influence of this has been great. The mind cure principles are beginning so to pervade the air that one catches their spirit at second hand. One hears of the gospel of relaxation, of the don't worry movement, of people who repeat to themselves youth, health, vigor, when dressing in the morning as their motto for the day. Complaints of the weather are getting to be forbidden in many households, and more people are recognizing it to be bad form to speak of disagreeable sensations or to make much of the ordinary inconveniences and ailments of life. These general tonic effects on public opinion would be good even if the more striking results were non-existent, but the latter abound so that we can afford to overlook the innumerable failures and self-deceptions that are mixed in with them. For in everything, human failure is a matter of course, and we can also overlook the verbiage of a good deal of the mind cure literature, some of which is so moonstruck with optimism and so vaguely expressed that an academically trained intellect finds it almost impossible to read it at all. The plain fact remains that the spread of the movement has been due to practical fruits, and the extremely practical turn of character of the American people has never been better shown than by the fact that this, their only decidedly original contribution to the systematic philosophy of life, should be so intimately knit up with concrete therapeutics. To the importance of mind cure, the medical and clerical professions in the United States are beginning, though with much recalcitrancy and protesting, to open their eyes. It is evidently bound to develop still farther, both speculatively and practically, and its latest writers are far and away the ableist of the group. Now, I'm facing a lot of this nonsense of criticism. That's an ableist comment, or you have to presume that people are physically and mentally disabled beyond the point of, I don't know, being responsible for their beliefs, their actions, and not being able to do the easiest of physical tasks if they don't want to, even if they seem to be physically able to. Now, there are people with real physical and mental disabilities, but a lot of what I'm talking about is the emo movement, the SJWs. But William James is referring to Mr. Horatio and W. Dresser and Mr. Henry Wood's work that are published by G.P. Putnam's Sons, and Mr. Wood's works by Lee and Shepard Boston. Okay. One of the ways they criticize religion as the opiate of the masses, same thing as the amphetamine of the masses, is that the underlying issue is sort of covered up by driving it up or down. And let's not turn to official drugs in the same way. You gotta, if there's real chemical imbalances, deal with those. Just don't try to drug away the symptoms, because then you end up with more problems, right? It matters nothing that just as there are hosts of persons who cannot pray, so there are greater hosts who cannot by any possibility be influenced by the mind-curer's ideas. Well, possibility, but they're not going to accept it, right? For our immediate purpose, the important point is so large a number should exist who can be so influenced. They form a psychic type to be studied with respect. And lest William James's own testimony be suspected, he quotes another reporter, Dr. H.H. Goddard of Clark University, whose thesis on the effects of mind on body, as evidenced by faith cures, is published in the American Journal of Psychology for 1899, Volume 10. This critic, after a wide study of the facts, concludes that the cures by mind cure exist, but are in no respect different from those now officially recognized in medicine as cures by suggestion, and the end of his essay contains an interesting physiological speculation as to the way in which the suggestive ideas may work, page 67 of the reprint. As regards the general phenomenon of mental cure itself, Dr. Goddard writes, in spite of the severe criticism we have made of reports of cure, there still remains a vast amount of material showing a powerful influence of the mind in disease. Many cases are of diseases that have been diagnosed and treated by the best physicians of the country, or which prominent hospitals have tried their hand at curing, but without success. People of culture and education have been treated by this method with satisfactory results. Diseases of long standing have been ameliorated and even cured. We have traced the mental element through primitive medicine and folk medicine of today, patent medicine, and witchcraft. Well, originally, I'm not sure exactly what he means here, but originally witchcraft meant that you were consciously dealing with demons, invoking, evoking, whatever you want to call it, making pacts. So it was sort of a conscious thing. It's not the same thing as straight up regular polytheism, of which, but perhaps they just mean it's unofficial religious claims, like, oh, if it's not Christianity, it's witchcraft, right? We are convinced that it is impossible to account for the existence of these practices if they did not cure disease, and that if they cured disease, it must have been the mental element that was effective. The same argument applies to those modern schools of mental therapeutics, divine healing, and Christian Science. It is hardly conceivable that the large body of intelligent people who comprise the body known distinctly as mental scientists should continue to exist if the whole thing were a delusion. It is not a thing of today. It is not confined to a few. It is not local. It is true that many failures are recorded, but that only adds to the argument. There must be many and striking success to counterbalance the failures. Otherwise, the failures would have ended the delusion. Christian Science. I wonder what's in the four dots, so we have like sentences, right? Um, Christian Science, divine healing, or mental science do not, and never can, in the very nature of things, cure all diseases. Nevertheless, the practical applications of the general principles of the broadest mental science will tend to prevent disease. Again, four dots. We do find sufficient evidence to convince us that the proper reform in mental attitude would relieve many a sufferer of ills that the ordinary physician cannot touch, would even delay the approach of death to many a victim beyond the power of absolute cure, and the faithful adherence to a truer philosophy of life will keep many a man well and give the doctor time to devote to alleviating ills that are unpreventable. To come now a little closer in quarters with their creed. The fundamental pillar on which it rests is nothing more than the general basis of all religious experience, the fact that man has a dual nature and is connected with two spheres of thought, a shallower and profounder sphere, in either of which he may learn to live more habitually. The shallower and lower sphere is that of the fleshly sensations, instincts, and desires of egotism, doubt, and the lower personal interests. But whereas Christian theology has always considered frowardness to be the essential vice of this part of human nature, the mind curers say that the mark of the beast in it is fear. And this is what gives such an entirely new religious turn to their persuasion. Now, if you look at my 603 score 6 playlist, the number is not as sinister as we are generally led to think. And there's two other numbers that are given real possibility if we're going to go the route of the negative there. And then there's numbers that I've done videos on that have clearly more negative meaning than any of those three numbers. Fear, to quote a writer of the school, has had its uses in the evolutionary process and seems to constitute the whole forethought in most animals. But that it should remain any part of the mental equipment of human civilized life is an absurdity. I find that the fear element of forethought is not stimulating to those more civilized persons, to whom duty and attraction are the natural motives, but is weakening and deterrent. As soon as it becomes unnecessary, fear becomes a positive deterrent and should be entirely removed as dead flesh is removed from living tissue. To assist in the analysis of fear and in the denunciation of its expressions, I have coined the word fear thought to stand for the unprofitable element of forethought, and have defined the word worry as fear thought in contradistinction to forethought. I have also defined fear thought as the self-imposed or self-permitted suggestion of inferiority in order to place it where it really belongs, in the category of harmful, unnecessary, and therefore not respectable things. Now, feared, quote, Horace Fletcher, happiness is found in forethought minus fear thought. Mentaculture Series 2, Chicago and New York, 1897, page 21 to 25, abridged. The misery habit, the martyr habit engendered by the prevalent fear thought gets pungent criticism from the mind cure writers. Now, one of the things that you find interesting, that I find interesting, is that in the Islamic world, the focus is on regard. Yeah, sure, you're fearing the consequences. That's definitely part of it. But it's more of a general regard. Like there is the idea of a fear prayer, but the prayer is in a way stepping aside from the fear, but regarding the fear and not trying to repress it to the point where you're, giving full form and time like you would if you were free. But anyways, H.W. Dresser, Voices of Freedom, New York, 1899, page 38, says, "Consider for a moment the habits of life into which we are born. There are certain social conventions or customs and alleged requirements. There is a theological bias, a general view of the world. There are conservative ideas in regard to our early training, our education, marriage, and occupation in life." Now, the conservative ideas, the freedom of the Gospels, that's what Jesus was there for. He wasn't to do away with the jot or tittle of the law. He wasn't to do anything but preach the doctrine of the one who sent him. But the interpretations of others, that's where the freedom was from. So both the liberal and conservative proper, not political, there was supposed to be freedom from that as true fundamentalists, not as the hate speech that sprung up after this book was written. I find very few fundamentalist Christians. Following close upon this, there is a long series of anticipations, namely that we shall suffer certain children's diseases of middle life and of old age, the thought that we shall grow old, lose our faculties, and again become childlike, while crowning all is the fear of death. Then there is a long line of particular fears and trouble-bearing expectations, such, for example, as ideas associated with certain articles of food, the dread of the east wind, the terrors of hot weather, the aches and pains associated with cold weather, the fear of catching cold if one sits in a draught, the coming of hay fever upon the 14th of August in the middle of the day, and so on through a long list of fears, dreads, worriments, anxieties, anticipations, expectations, pessimisms, morbidities, and the whole ghostly train of fateful shapes which our fellow men and especially physicians are ready to help us conjure up, an array worthy to rank with Bradley's unearthly ballot of bloodless categories. Now, I read somewhere that their earliest record frost temperatures were on the 21st of October, and the latest were May 2nd. So the sort of fear where you prepare for that sort of thing, that's sort of different, right? But to go, oh no, it's gonna, just, do what you have to do by the situation, because honestly, for a good month at that time, you're talking that one's probably not going to have to deal with those temperatures, so but you might want to skip planting things that can't survive those temperatures, or covering things that, Anyways, Henry Wood's Ideals Suggestion Through Mental Photography, 1899, page 54, says, "Yet this is not all. This vast array is swelled by innumerable volunteers from daily life. The fear of accident, the possibility of calamity, the loss of property, the chance of robbery, of fire, or the outbreak of war. And it is not deemed sufficient to fear for ourselves. When a friend is taken ill, we must forthwith fear the worst and apprehend death. If one meets with sorrow, sympathy means to enter into and increase the suffering. Man, to quote another writer, often has fear stamped upon him." That quote was Voices of Freedom. And the next one was Henry Wood. "Man, to quote another writer, often has fear stamped upon him before his entrance into the outer world. He is reared in fear. All his life is passed in bondage to fear of disease and death, and thus his whole mentality becomes cramped, limited, and depressed, and his body follows its shrunken pattern and specification. Think of the millions of sensitive and responsible souls among our ancestors who have been under the domination of such a perpetual nightmare, is it not surprising that health exists at all? Nothing but the boundless divine love, exuberance, and vitality constantly poured in, even though unconsciously to us, could in some degree neutralize such an ocean of morbidity. Okay. Although the disciples of the mind cure often use Christian terminology, one sees from such quotations how widely their notion of the fall of man diverges from that of ordinary Christians. Well, there's a lot of difference biblically where to go with some of these things. Whether it differs so much from Christ's own notion is for the exegesis to decide. According to Harnack, Jesus felt about evil and disease much as our mind curers do. What is the answer which Jesus sends to John the Baptist? Asks Harnack, and says it is this: the blind see and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead rise up, and the gospel is preached to the poor. That is the coming of the kingdom, or rather, in these saving works, the kingdom is already there. By the overcoming and removal of misery, of need, of sickness, by these actual effects, John is to see that the new time has arrived. The casting out of devils is only a part of this work of redemption, but Jesus points to that as the sense and seal of his mission. Thus to the wretched, sick, and poor did he address himself, but not as a moralist, and without a trace of sentimentalism. He never makes groups and departments of the ills. He never spends time in asking whether the sick one deserves to be cured, and it never occurs to him to sympathize with the pain or the death. He nowhere says that sickness is a beneficent infliction and that evil has a healthy use. Well, hardship and evil are different. Same thing with hardship not being the same as suffering. So there are three different groups. It's important to distinguish that. No, he calls sickness, sickness, and health, health. All evil, all wretchedness is, for him, something dreadful. It is of the kingdom of Satan. So sort of Manichaeanism, right? But he feels the power of the Savior within him. He knows that advance is possibly only when weakness is overcome and when sickness is made well. Das Wesen des Christentums, 1900, page 39. And, okay. Their notion of man's higher nature is hardly less divergent, being decidedly pantheistic. It's good they're admitting, that they're not monotheist, because monotheistic isn't monotheism, so it's an odd title for it in the first place. The spiritual in man appears in the mind cure philosophy as partly conscious, but chiefly subconscious, and through the subconscious part of it, we are already one with the divine, without any miracle of grace or abrupt creation of a new inner man. As this view is variously expressed by different writers, we found in it traces of Christian mysticism, of transcendental idealism, of Vedantism, and of the modern psychology of the subliminal self. A quotation or two will put us at the central point of view. And this quotation is from R.W. Trine, In Tune with the Infinite, 26,000, New York, 1899, of strung stratted pages together. The great central fact of the universe is that the spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all, that manifests itself and through all, the spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all is what I call God. I care not what term you may use, be it kindly light, providence, the oversoul, omnipotence, or whatever term may be most convenient, so long as we are agreed in regard to the great central fact itself. God then fills the universe alone, so that all is from him and in him. There is nothing that is outside. He is the life of our life, our very life itself. We are partakers of the life of God, and though we differ from him in that we are individualized spirits, while he is the infinite spirit, including us as well as all else besides, yet in essence the life of God and the life of man are identically the same, and so are one. They differ not in essence or quality, they differ in degree. The great central fact of human life is the coming into a conscious, vital realization of our oneness with the infinite life and the opening of ourselves fully to this divine inflow. In just the degree that we come into a conscious realization of our oneness with the infinite life and open ourselves to this divine inflow, do we actualize in ourselves the qualities and powers of the infinite life? Do we make ourselves channels through which the infinite intelligence and power can work? In just the degree in which you realize your oneness with the infinite spirit, you will exchange disease for ease, inharmony for harmony, suffering and pain for abounding health and strength. To recognize our own divinity and intimate relation to the universe is to attach the belts of our machinery to the powerhouse of the universe. One need remain in hell no longer than one chooses. If we can rise to any heaven we ourselves choose, and when we choose so to rise, all the higher powers of the universe combine to help us heavenward. Now we can phrase that a little bit different, throw in more about the work of what works in life, love not as the usual Christian sense, and personal responsibility, and a little more clear language of realization and individuation, and you basically have the Luciferian doctrine there. Let me now pass from these abstracter statements to some more concrete accounts of experience with the mind-cure religion. I have many answers from correspondents. The only difficulty is to choose. The first two, whom I shall quote, are my personal friends. One of them, a woman, writing as follows, expresses well the feeling of continuity with the infinite power by which all mind-cure disciples are inspired. The first underlying cause of all sickness, weakness, or depression is the human sense of separateness from that divine energy which we call God, the soul which can feel and affirm in serene but jubilant confidence, as did the Nazarene, I and my Father are one, has no further need of healer or of healing. This is the whole truth in a nutshell, and other foundation for wholeness can no man lay than this fact of impregnable divine union. Disease can no longer attack one whose feet are planted on this rock, who feels hourly, momently, the influx of the deific breath. If one with omnipotence, how can weariness enter the consciousness? How illness can assail that indomitable spark? This possibility of annulling forever the law of fatigue has been abundantly proven in my own case, for my earlier life bears a record of many, many years of bedridden invalidism, with spine and lower limbs paralyzed. My thoughts were no more impure than they are today. Although my belief in the necessity of illness was dense and unenlightened, but since my resurrection in the flesh, I have worked as a healer unceasingly for 14 years without a vacation, and can truthfully assert that I have never known a moment of fatigue or pain, though coming in touch constantly with excessive weakness, illness, and disease of all kinds. For how can a conscious part of deity be sick, since greater is he that is with us than all that can strive against us? My second correspondent, also a woman, sends me the following statement. Life seemed difficult to me at one time. I was always breaking down and had several attacks of what is called nervous prostration, with terrible insomnia, being on the verge of insanity, besides having many other troubles, especially of the digestive organs. I had been sent away from home in charge of doctors, and taken all the narcotics, stopped all work, been fed up, and in fact knew all the doctors within reach, but I never recovered permanently till this new thought took possession of me. I think that the one thing which impressed me most was learning the fact that we must be in absolute constant relation or mental touch. This word is to me very expressive, with that essence of life which permeates all and which we call God. This is almost unrecognizable unless we live it into ourselves. Actually, that is, by a constant turning to the very innermost, deepest consciousness of our real selves are of God in us. for illumination from within, just as we turn to the sun for light, warmth, and invigoration without. When you do this consciously, realizing that to turn inward to the light within you is to live in the presence of God or your divine self, you soon discover the unreality of the objects to which you have hitherto been turning and which have engrossed you without. I have come to disregard the meaning of this attitude for bodily health as such, because that comes of itself as an incidental result, and cannot be found by any special mental act or desire to have it beyond that general attitude of mind I have referred to above, that which we usually make the object of life, those outer things we are all so wildly seeking, which we so often live and die for, but which then do not give us peace and happiness. They should all come of themselves as accessory, and as the mere outcome or natural result of a far higher life, sunk deep in the bosom of the Spirit. This life is the real seeking of the kingdom of God, the desire for his supremacy in our hearts, so that all else comes as that which shall be added unto you, as quite incidental and has a surprise to us, perhaps, and yet it is the proof of the reality of the perfect poise in the very center of our being. When I say that we commonly make the object of our life that which we should not work for primarily, I mean many things which the world considers praiseworthy and excellent, such as success in business, fame as author or artist, physician or lawyer, or renown in philanthropic undertakings. Such things should be results, not objects. I would also include pleasures of many kinds which seem harmless and good at the time, and are pursued because many accept them. I mean conventionalities, sociabilities, and fashions in their various development, these being mostly approved by the masses, although they may be unreal and even unhealthy superfluities. Here is another case, more concrete, also that of a woman. I read you these cases without comment. They express so many varieties of the state of mind we are studying. And of course, I can comment. So, will I or will I not? I had been a sufferer from my childhood till my 40th year. Details of ill health are given, which I omit. I had been in Vermont several months, hoping for good from the change of air, but steadily growing weaker, when one day during the latter part of October, while resting in the afternoon, I suddenly heard, as it were, these words: "You will be healed, and do a work you never dreamed of." These words were impressed upon my mind with such power, I said at once that only God could have put them there. I believed them in spite of myself and of my suffering and weakness, which continued until Christmas, when I returned to Boston. Within 2 days, a young friend offered to take me to a mental healer. This was January 7th, 1881. The healer said, "There is nothing but mind. We are expressions of the one mind. Body is only a mortal belief. As a man thinketh, so he is." I could not accept all she said, but I translated all that was there for me in this way: there is nothing but God. Or as the Sufis say, well, some Sufis, illallah, you know, some take that too far. It's part of a bigger phrase. I am created by him and am absolutely dependent upon him. Mind is given me to use, and by just so much of it as I will put upon the thought of right action in body, I shall be lifted out of the bondage to my ignorance and fear and past experience. That day I commenced accordingly to take a little of every food provided for the family, constantly saying to myself, the power that created the stomach must take care of what I have eaten. By holding these suggestions through the evening, I went to bed and fell asleep, saying, I am soul, spirit, just one with God's thought of me, and slept all night without waking. For the first time in several years, the distress turns had usually recurred about 2 o'clock in the night. I felt the next day like an escaped prisoner, and believed that I had found the secret that would in time give me perfect health. Within 10 days I was able to eat anything provided for others, and after 2 weeks I began to have my own positive mental suggestions of truth, which were to me like stepping stones. I will note a few of them. They came about 2 weeks apart. First, I am soul, therefore it is well with me. Second, I am soul, therefore I am well. Third, a sort of inner vision of myself as a four-footed beast with a protuberance on every part of my body where I had suffering. Well, suffering is not the same thing as hardship, but when he's going through difficult anyways, with my own face begging me to acknowledge it as myself, I resolutely fixed my attention on being well and refused to even look at my old self in this form. Fourth, again the vision of the beast far in the background with a faint voice, again refusal to acknowledge. Fifth, once more the vision, but only of my eyes with the longing look, and again the refusal. Then came the conviction, the inner consciousness that I was perfectly well and always had been, for I was soul, an expression of God's perfect thought. That was to me the perfect and complete separation between what I was and what I appeared to be. I succeeded in never losing sight after this of my real being by constantly affirming this truth, and by degrees, though it took me 2 years of hard work to get there, I expressed health continuously throughout my whole body. In my subsequent 19 years' experience, I have never known this truth to fail when I applied it, though in my ignorance I have often failed to apply it. But through my failures, I have learned that the simplicity and trustfulness of the little child. But I fear that I risk tiring you by so many examples, and I must lead you back to philosophic generalities again. You see already by such records of experience how impossible it is not to class mind cure as primarily a religious movement. Its doctrine of the oneness of our life with God's life is, in fact, quite indistinguishable from an interpretation of Christ's message, which, in these very Gifford lectures, has been defended by some of your very ablest Scottish religious philosophers. The Cairds, for example, in Edward Caird's Glasgow lectures of 1890 to 1892, passages like this abound. The declaration made in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of heaven is at hand passes with scarce a break into the announcement that the kingdom of God is among you, and the importance of this announcement is asserted to be such that it makes, so to speak, a difference in kind between the greatest saints and prophets who lived under the previous reign of division and the least in the kingdom of heaven. The highest ideal is brought close to men and declared to be within their reach. They are called to be perfect as their Father in heaven, who is perfect. The sense of alienation and distance from God, which has so grown upon the pious in Israel, just in proportion as they had learned to look upon him as no mere national divinity, but as a God of justice who would punish Israel for its sin as certainly as Edom or Moab, is declared to be no longer in place, and the typical form of Christian prayer points to the abolition of the contrast between this world and the next, which, through all the history of the Jews, has continually been growing wider, as in heaven, so on earth. The sense of the division of man from God as a finite being from the infinite, as weak and sinful from the omnipotent goodness, is not indeed lost, but it can no longer overpower the consciousness of oneness. The terms Son and Father at once state the opposition and mark its limit. They show that it is not an absolute opposition, but one which presupposes an indestructible principle of unity, that it can and must become a principle of reconciliation. The Evolution of Religion, 2, page 146 and 147. But philosophers usually profess to give a quasi-logical explanation of the existence of evil, whereas the general fact of evil in the world, the existence of the selfish, suffering, timorous, finite consciousness. The mind cure, so far as I'm acquainted with them, profess to give no speculative explanation. Evil is empirical there for them as it is for everybody. But the practical point of view predominates, and it would ill agree with the spirit of their system to spend time in worrying over it as a mystery or problem, or laying to heart the lesson of its experience after the manner of the evangelicals. Don't reason about it, as Dante says, but give a glance and pass beyond. It is avidya, ignorance, something merely to be outgrown and left behind, transcended and forgotten. Christian Science, so-called the sect of Miss Eddy, is the most radical branch of mind cure in its dealings with evil. For evil is simply a lie, and anyone who mentions it is a liar. And